contributions to Oklahoma and to the nation. To tell us about him this evening is Jack Conn of Oklahoma City. Many of you know Mr. Conn. He is from Ada and originally from Ada and knew Governor Kerr in the early years. Presently, Mr. Conn is chairman of the board and chief executive officer of Fidelity National Bank. In addition, he serves in many civic capacities, and the thing I like about him most of all, that not only is he a mighty great personality, a mighty fine fellow, but he is a first-class historian. He loves history. He feels that history is the truth in the word, and this is what gives me so much abiding pleasure. He, for example, is chairman of the Oklahoma City Bicentennial Commission, and just the other day was instrumental in getting the great bicentennial monument in Bicentennial Park going, and so it goes with Mr. Conn and historical projects. It's also a pleasure to serve with him, and I think it's a great honor to me that he serves on the board of directors of the Oklahoma Historical Society. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Mr. Conn. Jack?
Thank you so much. Do you really need this microphone, or can you hear me? I'd rather dispense with it, and then I won't have to worry about it. Palmer, I thought your stories about Bill Murray were great, and there's one which I must add, which is on me. Dr. Linscheid, whom you mentioned, had served as president of East Central for 25 years, and that was a record. As you said, presidents of colleges were in the spoil system. But he finally made it for 25 years, and we had a great ceremony in Ada, befitting the occasion. And I was out, of course, and been invited to appear. And W.D. Little, the editor of the Evening News, took me over to Governor Bill Murray. Bill was sitting there with this scarf around his neck, although it was in the hot summertime, and Mr. Little took me over and he said, Governor, this is Jack Conn. The governor said, who? Said, Jack Conn. He's going to be the master of ceremonies tonight. The old governor looked me right in the eye and he said, why? And every time I appear as master of ceremonies, or indeed on occasion like this, I always remind myself of the governor's question, why? Well, it is a great pleasure and privilege for me to be here and talk to you about a man whom I admired so much, who was my cherished friend over a long, long period of time, Robert Samuel Kerr. My friendship with the Kerrs goes back a long, long time. When we lived in Ada, the Kerr family lived about 4 blocks from us. We were the proud possessors of a little bird dog named Jip. Jip had the wonderful habit of crawling on her belly up to people when they passed her house and nipping them on the ankles. One day, Mother Kerr, Bob Kerr's mother, came by and Jip did her thing. And that was my first acquaintance with the Kerrs, and she was very frustrated and more than somewhat irritated. Later on, I attended Bob Kerr's class at the Baptist church, but being a thoroughly sprinkled Presbyterian, my attendance at his class was a little bit sporadic. In 1937, Bob offered to send me through law school and lend me the money, a gesture for which I have never forgotten. Then I joined Bob's old law firm in Ada under his brother Aubrey. I worked in every campaign he ever had. I made speeches. I knocked on doors. I did whatever else he thought was helpful. When he went to Washington, I was a frequent caller at his office. I knew his mother and father. The senator and his wife, the senator's 4 children, his 3 brothers, Aubrey, Travis, and Billy. And what I shall say represents a great deal of my own thoughts and knowledge of the senator, and I hope that they may be of some interest to you. Bob Kerr was born in a log cabin not too far from Ada on September 11, 1896. Now, a log cabin in those days did not connote poverty. There weren't any trains into Ada. The only building materials that came in had to be brought in by covered wagon, and hence people built with what they had, sometimes sod houses, sometimes log houses. Bob's mother and father were not people of great substance by any stretch of the imagination, but they gave to Bob something that is far richer, far better than many rich people give to their children. They gave him faith. They gave him a belief in the Bible and an appreciation of it. They were very devout, fine Christian people. And I suppose that their faith could be, and I believe, epitomized in 3 verses from Scripture. They believed this: and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. And then, the eternal God is thy refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. And finally, for we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were destroyed, we have a building of God, and house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. My friends, faith is the antithesis of fear, and always its conqueror. Surely the greatest mortal blessing is to live without fear. Fear found no sanctuary in Bob Kerr's heart because of the great faith that his parents had imparted to him. All right. Short time before his death, he said this with all sincerity: the only thing which can compare with the joy of living this life is the sound hope that we may have an even better one later. In addition to this great faith which his parents gave to him, they also gave him a thirst for knowledge. He attended the Ada Public Schools, East Central College, OBU, OU. Then he served a stint in World War I as an artillery officer. When he came back, he started reading the law in the office of Judge J.F. McKeel. Finally, he was admitted to the bar, and later on became a member of the firm of Harrell and Kerr. Bob lost his first wife, Reba Shelton, in childbirth when he was still a very young man. It was a great blow to this fledgling lawyer. Later on in 1925, he met Grace Breen, whom he married that year. They have 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. That was a year that Bob Kerr, the year after that, embarked on the oil business. He had a brother-in-law named Jim Anderson. Jim had a drilling rig, and he and Bob prevailed upon some banker, goodness knows how, to lend the money to buy another drilling rig. So they had an oil company, and it was called Anderson Kerr. Anderson Kerr went along drilling wells primarily in the Oklahoma City field until about 1936, when Jim Anderson resigned and retired. At that time, the year following, Bob Kerr employed Bob Lynn and D.A. McGee, both from Phillips Petroleum Company. Dean McGee was then recognized as a very fine geologist. Later on in 1946, Kerr Lynn's name was changed. Bob Lynn resigned, and the name was changed to Kerr McGee Oil Industries, Inc. time and time again attests that the best business decision that Bob Kerr ever made was when he got Dean McGee. They were a very perfect team. Dean was a voice of caution, the voice of detail, the voice of weighing consequences. Bob was inclined to take a chance. A story that illustrates that: just a few months before his death, they dedicated a fine offshore rig down in the Gulf of Mexico. Dean and Bob had gone down to the ceremonies dedicating the new rig, and Bob had climbed to the top of it, and he'd come back down. It was cost probably $6 or $7 million to build it. Bob came back down and said, "Dean, let's build another one." And Dean said, "Hell, Bob, let's pay for this one first." That was the perfect team, and they had great respect and love for each other. To emphasize to you what a great contribution that Dean McGee has made and why it was Bob's best business decision, I'll give you some asset growth. On June 30, 1937, when Dean McGee joined the company, the assets of the company were $2,937,000. In 1954, when Dean became the president of Kerr McGee, the assets were $43,296,000. And on December 31, 1975, the assets of Kerr McGee stood at $1,387,000,000. Although Bob continued his interest in business and in Kerr McGee until the date of his death, he soon succumbed to the one thing that it's one of his great loves, and that was politics. In 1938, he supported Red Phillips for governor, and Red Phillips squeaked out a very narrow victory over W.S. Key. After Phillips' inauguration, the friendship waned, and then it vanished. And poor Bob found himself much in the same position as Shakespeare's Wooster, who said, "Our house, my sovereign liege, little deserves the scourge of greatness to be used on it, and the same greatness to which our own hands have hoped to make so portly." During the Phillips administration, in 1940, Bob was elected Democratic National Committeeman. And during this term as Democratic National Committeeman occurred one of the things that evidences his great riposte and his great repartee. Bob had been invited to speak to a civic group in Oklahoma City, and the Republicans had demanded equal time. The Republicans were given equal time. They brought in a ringer, a fellow by the name of Irvin S. Cobb, one of the great speakers of the day, one of the great raconteurs, one of the fine historians. Well, as guest speaker, Cobb was given the privilege of speaking first since he was out of state. He proceeded to give the Democrats unshirted hell. And finally he ended up by saying, "I come from the great state of Kentucky, where there's nothing but thoroughbreds. And my people don't know what to do about curs." Well, of course, the audience was delighted with this fine play on words, and Bob came to his feet and he said, "I too have been to the great state of Kentucky. I've seen its bluegrass and I've seen its fine thoroughbred horses. And I can appreciate the dilemma which faces the people of Kentucky in not knowing what to do about curs. But the people of Oklahoma face no similar dilemma because they know what to do about cobs." Those who took on Bob Kerr found that it was not a very safe venture. He had a keen mind and a sizzling wit. In 1942, he ran for governor. His most formidable opponent was Gomer Smith. Gomer Smith possessed one of the most beautiful voices I've ever heard in my life. When he spoke over the radio, my goodness alive, he had the organ music playing back of him, and he was talking about the old-aged people and whatnot. He just wrapped you up. Political pundits said if he could have spoken to all the people in Oklahoma at one time, he would have been elected. And I think that's true, and with television, of course, he could have done it. Well, Kerr won, but it was not a very easy victory. In Pontotoc County headquarters, which I worked in, we had our problems. See, that was the time that you went out, there weren't any television sets, and you went out and drummed up a crowd to speak, and I had been chosen to speak at Mill Creek. So here I went to Mill Creek, my wife and myself, and we had an old phonograph, one of the hand-crank deals, and it was her job to play the phonograph to drum the crowd up while I walked around handing out Bob Kerr cards. And she said, well, what record's playing? I said, Joel, just play them as they come to it, you know. And so the first record was Stars and Stripes Forever, and that was all right. And then she turned the record over, and out came Clink, Clink, Let's All Take Another Drink. As you know, that did not comport with Bob Kerr's feelings about drinking one bit. But if you think that was troublesome, Gomer Smith ran on the platform, and about the only plank he had in it was that when I am elected governor, everyone who is 65 will go down to the mailbox, and in that mailbox will be $75 a month for the husband and $75 a month for the wife. No caseworkers, no nothing. If you're 65, you just get it. Well, we were having an awful hard time with that one. Somebody talked to Mother Kerr about Gomer Smith's platform, and here was her reply to a pretty good-sized gathering for Ada. She said, I don't believe in old age pensions, and Bob doesn't either. Said, we believe that children just ought to support their parents just exactly like Bob supports us. Well, it took a great deal of temerity to go out and tell Mother Kerr that her statements on the lines of old age pension was not being exactly helpful to her son's candidacy. Well, the general election was close. Kerr only won by about 16,000 votes. His opponent was Bill Otchin from Enid, a very fine, respected lawyer. And it finally ended up in the Supreme Court. I argued the case for the governor. Otchin said that there were many irregularities in some precincts in Oklahoma. The Supreme Court in a landmark decision asked this question, how many is some? In other words, if you're going to specify that you've lost an election because of irregularities, you've got to point out where you lost it and how you lost it. Bob was governor during the war years, and there really wasn't a great deal he could do. The war was being fought. He did do two things. He improved the educational system of the state, and second, he paid off a deficit of $44 million and left the state with a surplus of $40 million. Now then, I'm not going to try to tell you good and great people that Bob Kerr did not have an Achilles heel. Occasionally he did. In 1946, Bob decided he would elect his successor, somewhat like Palmer was talking about Murray. And he selected, the man to be his successor was H.C. Jones, who was formerly the Collector of Internal Revenue. He had two opponents, Roy Turner and Dixie Gilmer. And in the Democratic primaries, Mr. Jones ran a poor third. While Bob certainly knew his Bible, I'm afraid he forgot that even in biblical times, tax gatherers were not the idols of the masses. Then came the real turning point in his life. You know, some people have the prescience and the timing to take the right road. Perhaps it's luck, perhaps it's brains, whatever. Why is it that some people never have to look back in life and lament the road never taken? Bob made the fateful decision to run for the United States Senate in 1948. He defeated his old opponent Gomer Smith, primary, and ran over Ross Risley in the general election. Now the Senate afforded Bob Kerr the forum he needed for greatness. He had the precise talents to become its dominating force. On occasions, he could compromise with the ability of a Henry Clay. On other occasions, he could have the courage, the unbending will of a Sam Irving. And he certainly had the ability to rise to Websterian oratory. More than that. Much like Senators Russell, Taft, and Vandenberg, Kerr had the inward power and the grace of humility to achieve the respect and admiration of senators on both sides of the aisle. Regrettably, for a time, Bob was not happy being the senator from Oklahoma. His ambition pointed him toward the vice presidency, and I believe he got that in 1944 when he made that tremendous speech at the Democratic National Convention, his keynote speech of that convention. It was obvious that Wallace was not going to be Roosevelt's running mate. Kerr felt like that the lightning might strike, and he might be chosen as vice president after that great speech. Instead, Truman was chosen. He did not then forsake the idea of being president or vice president. In 1952, he sought the Democratic nomination for vice president, or for the presidency. He only had one chance, and that chance was that Truman would support him. Without that help, Senator Kerr had no chance to attain the nomination and did not get it. He had a few scattered votes, and that was about it. You know, to a great man, sometimes defeat can be changed into ultimate victory. After 1952, Bob made two decisions which ruled him the rest of his life. The first was he was going to become the senator by, for, and of Oklahoma. And the second thing was that he was determined never again to have any presidential ambitions or vice presidential ambitions. To show you the extent to which he dedicated himself to Oklahoma, he received a request from the Limestone Gap High School asking him to deliver the graduation address. He flew from Washington to Oklahoma and delivered that graduating address to 4 high school seniors. By chance, I was in his office one day, and a telephone call came in, and I heard the conversation, and I knew this fellow wanted something done. I knew who it was, and I turned around to the senator, and I said, "Bob, this guy fought you in every campaign. You surely not going to help him, are you?" "Well," he said, "Jackson, I took the oath of office to represent all the people of Oklahoma, and that includes those whose legitimacy is in question." I think one of the things that troubled him in his first term of office was that he never drank. He never touched a drop of whiskey in his life. Goodness sakes, he missed some, pardon me. But he never, he was raised that way. And one day I was in his office and there were 4 or 5 of us in there, and he came out in this resounding voice and he said, how am I getting along in Washington when I don't drink and I go to these cocktail parties? And one of the people there said, oh, just fine, Senator. You just do fine. He said, we tell everybody you're a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. The senator didn't appreciate the humor of that at all. Well, he was reelected in 1954 in a fairly close race, and then he began to approach the pinnacle of his power. The House of Representatives was completely dominated by Sam Rayburn. Lyndon Johnson and Robert S. Kerr were the powerhouses in the Senate. It cannot be truthfully said that they were able to pass all of the legislation that they wanted. But it can certainly be factually said that no important piece of legislation got through the Senate or the House that they opposed. 1960, he ran for his last term. He was elected by some 90,000 votes in the general election. That was the end of the Eisenhower regime. Democrats could smell the sweet scent of victory going back to the White House. Bob Kerr supported his old friend Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination with everything he had. Put all he had into it. What was not to be. And John F. Kennedy received the nomination. After receiving the nomination, Kennedy asked that Lyndon Johnson run with him as vice president. Lyndon was a little bit galled at having to step down into that. Nick wanted to turn it down. And there came a measure of Bob Kerr's greatness. Bob Kerr went to his old friend with that great sense of being able to sense of doing the right thing, of doing what must be done at the right time, and persuaded Lyndon Johnson to accept the vice presidential nomination. His appeal to patriotism overcame Johnson's pride. It was during the years from 1960 through 1963, at the time of his death on January 1, 1963, really 1961-62, that Kerr reached the zenith of his power. Senator Douglas of Illinois referred to him as the uncrowned king of the Senate. The senator further said that the only thing that Kennedy succeeded in getting legislation out of the Senate was what Bob Kerr wanted him to have. How did the senator obtain that position of eminence? Well, there were many facets to his success. The senator possessed a towering intellect, an incisive power of analysis. He could reduce the most complex problem to fundamentals. He always thought big, and his objectives were always far out. I remember the story about Bob and his disdain of details. Back when Whit Fenham was comptroller of Kerr McGee, a fella came in and had an appointment with Bob, and he asked Whit, said, now how do I conduct this interview? And Whit said, well, don't bother him with details. This fellow said, well, what do you think is a detail? And Whit said, well, when he gets $100,000 overdrawn, he wants to know about it. In the Senate debates, he was completely unequaled. He had a prodigious memory. He had the riposte that everyone feared. He had the repartee when he needed it. And more than that, he was always prepared. There was a Senator Homer Capehart, a Republican from Indiana, who was Bob's favorite pigeon. And Bob could always get Homer on the floor. and then just proceed to decimate him. And it happened every time. And any time that Homer took on Bob, the Republicans would run up and down the corridors and say, "Come on down to the floor, come on down to the floor. Bob's got Homer again. We've got to go rescue him." And illustrative of his tremendous power of mind, as second-ranking man on the Senate Finance Committee, he was given the great privilege and pleasure of interrogating Senator Humphrey, Secretary of the Treasury under Eisenhower. And at one point in his interrogation, Secretary Humphrey said, "Senator Kerr, you know more about my budget than I do." What he should have. Bob spent $50,000 of his own money hiring financial analysts to go over that budget. He was always ready. Another thing that he had was he had the friendship and respect of Republicans and Democrats alike. I shall never forget when I went to Washington soon after his death, and I met Senator Dirksen of Illinois, who was the minority leader of the Senate, at an American Bankers Association reception. We passed the time of day, and I said something about the death of Senator Kerr, and wonderful, fine, outstanding senator. Tears started down his eyes, and he said he was the best friend I ever had and one of the greatest senators that ever served. On the Democratic side, he had friends like Russell and Byrd and Long and many others. How did he attain these friendships? He attained them by being a friend. You know, for a long time in the United States Senate, if one senator from the Northeast wanted something done for the Northeast, everybody from the Southwest fought him. Bob decided that one way to do things. He decided the thing to do was to vote it on the merits. If the St. Lawrence Seaway needed an appropriation, he voted for it. Now, people will say that that was a deal of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours, and Bob knew he had the biggest back. If that's the case, so be it, because history reflects that what was done was for the best interest of the nation. The third factor that made him the uncrowned king of the Senate was the absolute loyalty of his staff. He never had any disloyalty, no backbiting, never feared there would be any tapes played back, never had any fear of anything. 13 years after his death, his first administrative assistant told me Senator Kerr was the greatest man I've ever known. At the pinnacle of his power, Bob attained many industries for Oklahoma, including those of the space industry. And during the 14 years he was in the Senate, he fought tooth and nail for the oil industry of Oklahoma. But measured by any measurement that I can think of, his greatest achievement has to be the Arkansas Navigation Waterway. He was ridiculed in Oklahoma. Editorials of ridicule were written in the leading newspapers of Oklahoma. And in the Daily Oklahoman, there was a cartoon that showed Bob on a steamboat, the steamboat mired in the sand, looking out down the Arkansas, and the caption of it was, "Steamboat Bob." What a great tragedy it is that he never lived to see that fine waterway completed and the barges going down. And although Tulsa, with the port of entry at Catoosa, stood the absolute chance to benefit more than any place in Oklahoma from the waterway, Bob Kerr never carried Tulsa County in a single election. But it's built. Where is the opposition? Where are the small people who could not see it? Well, as you know, Bob Kerr was interested in the soil, he was interested in water, he was interested in people. Sometime during about before his death, he and Carl Albert and Governor Raymond Gary and others had worked on a program of doing something about floodlands in eastern Oklahoma. And the people down there, in recognition of that, had constructed a very beautiful monument to the efforts of these men. And the senator appeared, and here's what he had to say in his book, Land, Wood, and Water, which quotes from what he said at this gathering. What more could a man ask from life? Only that the lessons learned in this patch of Oklahoma mountains be transmitted to the nation. Here is what can be done. On a small scale, here's an example of land, wood, and water for the United States, for a continent. It takes money, but not spendthrifts. Conservation pays for itself many times over. It takes cooperation, but not a fourth level of government. A unified approach is all that is required. It takes faith, but not blind faith. The future is plain for all to see at Poteau, Sandstone Creek, and at Lake Texoma. A nation preserved as God gave it to us. What, indeed, more can a man ask from life? If you would like to know something more about this great Oklahoman, about this great man who served the state so ably, I would ask you to again visit the Robert S Kerr Park here in Oklahoma City. You know, few indeed are the great men to whom things are built that fit. Your architects did so for Lincoln. They did so for Jefferson. If you would like to see Robert S. Kerr, visit the park. There you will see moving water, beautiful grass, and flowers, and the things he would have loved so much. His people enjoying his park.